Elias Rowan walked into the private lounge of Hawthorne Meridian Air wearing a jacket that had seen too many winters, a creased folder tucked under one arm, and a first-class ticket folded twice in his pocket. Before he could sit down, a security escort pulled him toward the exit while dozens of wealthy travelers watched with quiet contempt. The airline's young chief executive, Vivian Hawthorne Whitmore, glanced over just long enough to decide he did not belong there. 10 minutes later, inside a locked boardroom, the color drained from her face. The man she had just humiliated controlled 61% of the company that bore her family's name. If stories about quiet men who carry more power than anyone expects move you, stay close, because kindness like his deserves to be remembered. The Whitmore terminal rose out of the concrete like a monument to old money, its private lounge designed to resemble a five-star hotel more than an airport gate. Marble floors reflected the overhead lighting in soft gold streaks, and a pianist played somewhere near the champagne bar, as though the room existed outside of time. Elias Rowan stepped through the glass doors in a jacket worn thin at the elbows, his shoes scuffed from years of honest use, a brown envelope pressed against his chest, and an outdated phone buzzing quietly in his pocket. Around him stood men in tailored suits, women dripping in jewelry, and a scattering of minor celebrities waiting for private charters, and every one of them looked twice at Elias without meaning to. Preston Vale, the lounge's manager of premium guest experience, noticed him first and decided within seconds that a mistake had been made. He approached with the practiced smile of a man who had learned to smell out anyone who did not fit the room, and he asked Elias, with false politeness, whether he was lost. Elias answered calmly, handing over his boarding pass and a laminated invitation, but Preston barely looked at either before waving toward the door with two fingers. A few guests nearby exchanged amused glances when Elias mentioned, without raising his voice, that he had a meeting scheduled with the company's board of directors. Nobody believed him, and nobody bothered to hide their disbelief. Vivian Hawthorne Whitmore crossed the lounge a moment later, trailed by two assistants carrying tablets and a third holding her coffee at a careful distance. Preston seized the opportunity to prove his diligence, telling her under his breath that a man had wandered in who did not meet the standard of the lounge. Vivian turned her head for less than 2 seconds, taking in the frayed jacket, the creased envelope, and the plain, unremarkable face of a man she assumed she would never need to remember. She told Preston to handle it quietly and kept walking, already thinking about the crisis waiting for her upstairs. Her heels clicked against the marble in a rhythm that never once slowed down for Elias Rowan. Elias did not raise his voice or make a scene, though something in his eyes sharpened for a moment. He asked one simple question, whether she was certain she wanted him removed, and Vivian answered without turning fully around, saying the lounge was not a place for charity cases. The words landed harder than she intended, and for a brief second the chatter around them seemed to pause, as though even strangers sensed the weight of what had just been said. Elias absorbed it without flinching, the way a man absorbs something he has heard before in different rooms, from different people, wearing different faces. He allowed Preston to guide him toward the exit, past travelers who were already returning to their phones and their champagne. As the glass doors closed behind him, Elias paused for a moment and looked back at the Hawthorne Meridian Air crest mounted above the reception desk, its wings stretched wide in gleaming brass. His expression carried no anger, only a stillness that seemed almost out of place given what had just happened to him. Somewhere behind that calm exterior was a man who understood the true worth of that crest better than anyone standing in the room, though none of them would have believed it. He turned and walked toward the general seating area without another word, carrying his folder like a man carrying something far heavier than paper. Behind him, the lounge resumed its comfortable rhythm almost immediately, as though nothing of consequence had occurred at all. Glasses clinked, a bellhop wheeled a cart of monogrammed luggage past the reception desk, and the pianist drifted into a slower, more indulgent tune. Nobody in that room paused to wonder who the man in the worn jacket actually was, because the room had been built, quite deliberately, to reward exactly that kind of forgetting. Wealth had a way of making itself the only story worth noticing, and Elias understood that better than most of the people sipping champagne around him. He did not resent them for it. He simply recognized, with the tired clarity of long experience, how easily a room full of comfortable people could overlook the one thing that actually mattered. Vivian Hawthorne Whitmore had built her entire identity around being the youngest chief executive in the history of Hawthorne Meridian Air, a title she wore the way other people wore inherited jewelry. She had grown up inside a world of private academies, family charter jets, and dinner conversations where people were measured by their surnames, their watches, and the size of their portfolios. Every lesson of her childhood had reinforced the same idea, that competence and class were the same thing, and that the people who mattered most were the ones who looked like they mattered. It was a worldview so deeply embedded that she rarely noticed it operating, the way a person rarely notices the water they have always swum in. By the time she took over the airline from her father, she had never once been forced to question whether appearances could lie. The pressure on her that particular week had become almost unbearable. The airline's booking software had failed twice in 1 month, stranding thousands of passengers and igniting a wave of furious headlines. The fleet was aging faster than the maintenance budget could keep up with. Shareholders were demanding answers, and reporters had begun circling the story like birds waiting for something to fall. Into this chaos stepped Graham Kingsley, a billionaire investor with a reputation for swooping in on wounded companies, offering an acquisition so large it made several board members visibly relax. His only conditions were mass layoffs, the sale of unprofitable routes, and a quiet rebranding that would erase the Hawthorne name from the tail of every aircraft within 18 months. Vivian did not want to lose the airline her grandfather had built from 3 second-hand planes and a stubborn belief in punctuality. Yet she also had no counteroffer, no rescue plan, and no idea how close she stood to losing everything her family had spent generations assembling. She had convinced herself that salvation, if it came at all, would arrive wearing an expensive suit and carrying a familiar last name. That conviction was precisely why, when she noticed a man in a worn jacket standing in her private lounge, she assumed without hesitation that he belonged nowhere near the people who could actually help her. As she prepared to enter the boardroom, an assistant informed her that Sterling Blackwood, chairman of the board, was waiting on someone he called the final signature the company needed. Vivian assumed this mysterious signature belonged to some investment titan flying in from New York or Boston, someone with cufflinks worth more than a used car. She had no idea that the man Sterling was waiting for was the very same person she had just ordered removed from her own lounge. Somewhere down a marble hallway, Sterling Blackwood was already dialing a number with trembling fingers, his voice tight with something close to panic. Sterling's call connected, and his first words carried a desperation rarely heard from a man of his stature. He begged the person on the other end not to leave the airport, explaining that without a signature, the company would fall into Graham Kingsley's hands before the sun went down. On the other side of the terminal, standing near the general boarding gates, Elias Rowan answered plainly that he had just been thrown out of his own airline's private lounge. Sterling went silent for a long moment, the kind of silence that carries the sound of a man's stomach dropping through the floor. He understood, faster than anyone else in the building, that a small act of cruelty in a marble lounge had just become a catastrophe with the power to reshape the entire company. Sterling hung up the phone and pressed a hand against the wall, steadying himself the way a man steadies himself after narrowly avoiding a car accident. He had spent 30 years in the airline industry watching mergers rise and collapse, watching fortunes shift on the strength of a single signature, and never once had he imagined that the fate of Hawthorne Meridian Air would come down to a misunderstanding in a lounge. He thought of the shareholders waiting downstairs, the reporters circling outside with their cameras ready, and the thousands of employees who had no idea that their livelihoods were currently balanced on the goodwill of a man wearing a second-hand jacket. There was no time to explain the situation calmly or diplomatically. There was only time to run. Elias sat alone in the general seating area, surrounded by tired travelers, crying infants, and the low hum of overhead announcements. There was no theatrical grief in his posture, no bitterness twisting his features, only the quiet patience of a man accustomed to being underestimated. He opened the brown envelope and studied the documents inside, a set of legal papers designed to block the sale of Hawthorne Meridian Air to Graham Kingsley before the deal could be finalized. If he signed, the airline would survive intact, its employees protected, and Vivian would be handed one more chance to prove herself worthy of the company she led. If he simply walked away, as the lounge staff clearly wanted him to, Kingsley would win by nightfall. Years earlier, Elias had worked as a systems engineer specializing in flight scheduling and operational safety, a job that suited his quiet, analytical mind perfectly. During that time, he discovered a critical flaw in the airline's coordination software, one capable of causing dangerous scheduling conflicts on the runway, and he brought it directly to leadership with detailed proof. The executives of that era dismissed his warnings as the anxieties of a low-level employee who did not understand the bigger picture, and the flaw remained buried in the system for years. When the airline eventually spiraled into crisis under a mountain of debt and mismanagement, Elias used his patents, a settlement from an unrelated safety case, and the resources of his own small company to quietly buy up the airline's distressed debt. Over time, that debt converted into equity, and the equity converted into something almost nobody in the industry realized existed. He became the true owner of Hawthorne Meridian Air without ever stepping into a spotlight, and his reasons had nothing to do with modesty for its own sake. He believed the Hawthorne name still meant something to the thousands of employees who depended on steady paychecks, reliable schedules, and a sense of stability that sudden headlines could easily shatter. Publicity, in his mind, was a liability that could spook the very people he was trying to protect, so he chose silence instead of recognition. He did not need his name printed on aircraft or engraved on trophies. He needed the planes to run safely and the people who worked on them to keep their jobs. It was a decision built entirely on responsibility rather than pride, a distinction almost nobody in the building around him would have understood. There were nights, in the early years after the acquisition, when Elias sat alone in his small home office reviewing maintenance logs and safety reports long after his daughter had gone to sleep. He never hired a public relations team to craft his image, never gave interviews, and never allowed his name to appear on the annual reports that circulated among investors. Instead, he built a quiet system of trusted people, Sterling among them, who understood the arrangement and respected his wish to remain invisible. It was not loneliness that drove this decision, though there were moments it felt that way, but a conviction that the company needed steadiness more than it needed a face. He had watched too many businesses collapse under the weight of a single celebrated leader, and he refused to let Hawthorne Meridian Air become dependent on his own visibility to survive. While Elias sat with his papers, Preston Vale walked past the general seating area on his way to another assignment and could not resist one more comment. He told Elias, with a thin smile, that he should learn to recognize which spaces were meant for people like him. Elias looked up at him without anger, and said only that Preston would learn exactly where things stood very soon. Preston laughed under his breath. mistaking the calm response for the deflated grumbling of a man who had simply been embarrassed in public. He walked away already forgetting the exchange, unaware that his career had just quietly begun its collapse. Minutes later, Sterling Blackwood came rushing through the terminal himself, his gray hair disheveled and his tailored suit slightly out of place for a man usually defined by composure. He moved past business travelers and tired families until he spotted Elias sitting calmly among the crowd, and the sight of a board chairman searching so frantically for an ordinary-looking man drew stares from everyone nearby. Sterling stopped in front of him, out of breath, and lowered his head slightly in a gesture that startled even the gate agents standing close enough to notice. Airport employees exchanged confused glances as they watched a man in an expensive suit apologize to someone dressed like he had wandered in from a hardware store. The scene felt wrong to everyone watching, precisely because none of them yet understood who actually held the power in that terminal. Sterling straightened his tie and spoke the words that would soon detonate through the entire company. He told Elias that the boardroom upstairs was waiting for the true owner of Hawthorne Meridian Air, and that every decision being discussed depended entirely on him. For a brief moment, Elias simply looked at the folder in his hands, then rose from his seat with the unhurried calm of a man who had been waiting his whole life for people to finally see clearly. He followed Sterling through the terminal, past the very lounge that had rejected him less than an hour earlier, and this time nobody dared stop him at the door. The boardroom sat on the top floor of the terminal building, its windows overlooking the runway where aircraft climbed into a pale afternoon sky. Vivian, Graham Kingsley, legal director Maris Caldwell, and the rest of the board members were already seated, the air thick with the particular tension that surrounds decisions worth billions of dollars. Kingsley leaned back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who believed Vivian had already run out of alternatives. He had spent the morning imagining how quickly he could strip the airline down to its most profitable routes and rebuild it under a new name within 2 years. The door opened and Sterling stepped inside first, followed by Elias Rowan, still wearing the same worn jacket he had been wearing in the lounge. The entire room fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the air conditioning suddenly seemed loud. Vivian recognized him instantly, the same man she had ordered removed less than an hour ago, and her stomach tightened with a feeling she could not yet name. Preston, who had been summoned upstairs to deliver documents, turned pale the moment he saw Elias walk through the door, though he forced his expression into something resembling professionalism. Vivian demanded to know, with visible irritation, why this particular man had been allowed into a closed board meeting. Sterling did not answer her directly. Instead, he nodded toward Maris Caldwell, who opened a folder of her own and began speaking in the measured tone of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her head many times. She explained that Rowan Skyward Holdings, a company controlled entirely by Elias Rowan, held 61% of the voting shares in Hawthorne Meridian Air. She continued, stating plainly that the only person with the authority to approve, veto, appoint, or remove leadership within the company was the man now standing quietly near the door. Vivian felt the floor tilt beneath her, though her body remained perfectly still in her chair. Graham Kingsley's confident smile vanished as though someone had switched it off, and Preston stood frozen near the wall, unable to look directly at the man he had mocked less than 2 hours earlier. Everyone who had once dismissed Elias as someone who did not belong now found themselves unable to meet his eyes, the weight of their earlier judgment settling over the room like a physical presence. The transformation from ordinary traveler to controlling owner had taken less than 90 minutes, and it had happened entirely because nobody had bothered to look past his jacket. Elias did not raise his voice or gloat over the stunned faces around him. He placed the brown envelope on the polished table and spoke calmly, saying he had come to save the airline. But before signing anything, he needed to understand why his own company had just thrown its owner out of its own lounge. The question detonated through the room with far more force than any shout could have managed. Vivian tried to hold on to her composure, but a flush of humiliation crept up her neck as she began to grasp that her mistake was not simply rudeness toward one man. It was a symptom of an entire corporate culture that valued appearances over substance, one she had built and reinforced without ever questioning it. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the seat traditionally reserved for the most powerful person in the room, and lowered himself into it without ceremony. He opened his documents, looked slowly around at each face staring back at him, and said that it was time to discuss exactly why this airline was about to lose its soul. Vivian remained silent, watching the man she had dismissed take command of a room she had always assumed belonged to her alone. Graham Kingsley recovered his composure faster than anyone else in the boardroom and rose from his seat with practiced charm. He extended his hand toward Elias, calling him his new friend, and offered to raise his acquisition price on the spot while promising to keep the Hawthorne name intact. He even suggested painting Elias as a heroic silent investor for the press, a narrative Kingsley clearly believed would flatter a man he still assumed craved recognition. Elias remained unmoved by the gesture and did not immediately reach for the offered hand. Instead, he asked Kingsley directly what would happen to the 8,000 mechanics, flight attendants, dispatchers, and ground crew members currently employed by the airline. Kingsley answered in the vague, polished language of finance, using words like optimization, streamlining, and restructuring instead of anything resembling a straight answer. Elias understood immediately that this careful vocabulary was simply a softer way of describing mass layoffs dressed up to sound inevitable. He had heard this kind of language before, in meetings he attended long ago, back when his own warnings about safety had been buried under similar euphemisms. Vivian sat beside him, hearing the acquisition she had once seriously considered described from an angle she had never allowed herself to examine. Until this moment, she had focused almost entirely on spreadsheets, valuations, and the relief of finally escaping her mounting problems. Now, for the first time, she pictured actual human beings standing behind those tidy financial projections, people whose lives would be upended by a decision she had nearly approved. The realization did not arrive gently. It settled over her like a sudden change in cabin pressure, uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. Maris Caldwell placed additional documents on the table, outlining Kingsley's history with 3 previous transportation companies he had acquired and dismantled. In each case, he had stripped away valuable assets, slashed employee wages, dismantled the original brand, and walked away with substantial profit while leaving devastation behind him. Vivian felt a fresh wave of shock, realizing that her own advisory team had deliberately softened these details in the reports they had presented to her earlier that year. She wondered, with growing unease, how many other uncomfortable truths had been quietly filtered out before they ever reached her desk. Elias then delivered a second revelation that shifted the tension in the room even further. He revealed that he possessed evidence showing several members of the executive leadership had secretly accepted benefits from Kingsley's associates in exchange for pushing the acquisition forward. Preston had no direct involvement in these financial dealings, but his earlier behavior in the lounge had already marked him as a symbol of the deeper culture Elias intended to dismantle. Nearby, a vice president named Russell Danforth began visibly trembling, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though it might somehow steady him. Kingsley, sensing the tide turning firmly against him, lost his composure and snapped that Elias was nothing more than a lucky technician who had stumbled into wealth. Elias absorbed the insult without flinching and replied evenly that he had indeed once been a technician, and that experience taught him exactly what kept an aircraft safely in the sky. He explained that safety never came from a prestigious family name or an impressive title, but from ordinary people quietly doing their jobs correctly when nobody important was watching. The statement landed with unusual weight in a room full of people who had spent their careers believing the opposite. Maris Caldwell watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction, having spent years drafting policy memos that leadership routinely ignored in favor of faster, flashier decisions. She had warned the board twice before about Kingsley's pattern of acquisitions, presenting research that showed the same devastating outcome each time, only to be told the concerns were overly cautious. Now, watching Elias dismantle Kingsley's proposal with nothing more than calm questions and careful evidence, she felt something close to vindication settle over her. It was not triumph exactly, but the quiet relief of finally being heard in a room that had spent years talking over her. She made a small note in the margin of her folder, a reminder to herself that patience, however frustrating, sometimes did eventually pay off. Elias closed the discussion by announcing that the acquisition with Graham Kingsley was suspended indefinitely. He made it clear, however, that he had not yet decided to rescue Vivian's position as chief executive, since signing away Kingsley's threat was only the first of several questions he intended to answer that day. Before committing his resources to saving the company, he wanted to determine whether the woman currently running it deserved to continue leading it at all. The room understood in that moment that the true battle of the day was only just beginning. Vivian could no longer occupy the familiar, elevated position she had always relied on inside boardrooms and executive suites. Elias asked her to leave the polished conference room behind and walk with him through the operational areas of the airport instead, a request that marked a clear shift from paper authority toward something far more tangible. She hesitated only briefly before agreeing, sensing that refusing would confirm every unflattering assumption he had already begun forming about her leadership. Together they moved past security checkpoints and into corridors rarely seen by anyone above the rank of shift supervisor. The transition from marble hallways to scuffed linoleum floors felt, to Vivian, like stepping into an entirely different company. They passed through the dispatch office, the maintenance hangar, and long employee corridors lined with faded motivational posters and outdated equipment. Vivian noticed that many workers avoided meeting her eyes as she walked by, not out of respect, but out of a caution she had never previously recognized in herself. One ground crew member leaned toward Elias and mentioned quietly that safety concerns had been reported multiple times, only to be met with instructions to stay silent so the company's public image would remain untouched. Vivian's chest tightened as she absorbed the implication that her own leadership style had, without her fully realizing it, created an atmosphere where fear replaced honesty. Elias did not humiliate her by scolding her loudly in front of the staff. Instead, he allowed her to witness the truth firsthand and draw her own conclusions. A veteran maintenance technician named Nolan Pierce explained, in a calm and weary voice, that his department had been operating under a severely limited budget for years. He pointed out, almost as an afterthought, that the private lounge upstairs had recently been renovated with imported stone flooring, while his own team struggled to secure basic replacement parts. Vivian lowered her gaze, unable to summon any of the practiced justifications she usually relied on during difficult conversations. In a brief, quiet moment between corridors, Elias received a short phone call from his daughter, Nora, who simply wanted to know whether he had eaten dinner yet. His voice softened instantly, losing every trace of the firmness he had carried inside the boardroom, replaced by something gentler and unmistakably sincere. Vivian noticed the change immediately, and something shifted in the way she viewed him. recognizing that this man was not driven by any desire to defeat or humiliate her. He simply lived according to a quiet, consistent sense of responsibility, the kind she suspected she had never truly practiced in her own life. As they continued walking, Vivian began to understand why Elias had chosen to remain hidden as the company's true owner for so many years. To him, the airline had never been merely an asset sitting on a balance sheet, but a living network of livelihoods, a matter of professional dignity, and an unspoken promise to employees who had once been ignored by previous leadership. His silence had never been about modesty for its own sake. It had been a deliberate choice to protect people who depended on stability rather than spectacle. Vivian realized with a growing sense of shame that she had spent years mistaking loud confidence for genuine strength. Further down the corridor, they passed a small break room where 3 young flight attendants sat eating lunch out of plastic containers, their conversation dropping to silence the moment they noticed Vivian. She had walked past this same room dozens of times over the years without ever once stepping inside, always assuming her presence would only make the staff uncomfortable. Elias, without asking permission, pulled up an empty chair and asked the attendants how long they had each worked for the airline, and what changes they would make if anyone ever bothered to ask them. The youngest of the 3, a woman named Cassidy Marsh, hesitated before admitting that scheduling software often left crews stretched too thin during holiday weeks, a problem she had reported twice without any response. Vivian stood near the doorway, listening in a way she had never truly listened before, and understood that the distance between her office and this small room had never been about geography at all. They eventually reached a wide glass window overlooking the runway, where a Hawthorne Meridian Air aircraft prepared for takeoff beneath a darkening afternoon sky. Vivian spoke quietly, almost to herself, admitting that she had always believed she was protecting her family's legacy. Elias replied without cruelty, but without softening the truth either, telling her that what she had actually been protecting was her own chair at the head of the table. The words settled over her heavily, and for the first time since inheriting her position, she did not immediately object to a criticism aimed directly at her. When they returned to the boardroom, the atmosphere had shifted entirely from what it had been earlier that morning. Vivian no longer sat at the head of the table like a monarch presiding over her court. Instead, she took a seat directly across from Elias, prepared to listen rather than command. The remaining board members watched the change in her posture with visible surprise, sensing that something fundamental had shifted during her absence. Elias laid out 3 conditions that would determine whether he agreed to sign the documents necessary to save the company. First, the acquisition offer from Graham Kingsley would be permanently canceled without further negotiation. Second, an internal investigation would be launched into the hidden financial arrangements benefiting certain executives. Third, Vivian herself would be required to publicly apologize to the airline's employees for the toxic culture of favoritism that had defined the company, beginning with a direct acknowledgement of what had happened in the lounge that morning. Preston attempted to shift blame onto company policy, insisting that he had merely followed established standards for maintaining the lounge's premium image. Elias asked him plainly which standard permitted an employee to treat a paying guest with contempt before even verifying his credentials. Preston had no adequate answer, and his silence confirmed what everyone in the room already suspected. Vivian, forced to reckon with her own role in creating that culture, admitted quietly that her own attitude had given people, like Preston, permission to look down on others. Sensing his position collapsing, Graham Kingsley attempted one final maneuver, threatening lawsuits, negative press coverage, and a deliberate attack on the company's stock price if his offer was rejected. Elias remained composed and nodded toward Maris Caldwell, who calmly presented legal evidence proving Kingsley had violated a confidentiality agreement by secretly courting members of the executive board. In an instant, Kingsley transformed from a confident predator into a man cornered by his own greed, his expression tightening as the room's remaining sympathy evaporated entirely. The most immediate consequence followed swiftly. Russell Danforth was suspended on the spot, his access badge confiscated before he even left the building. Preston was removed from his position overseeing the VIP lounge, though Elias made clear this was not meant to be a moment of cheap revenge against any single individual. He explained that his goal was never to watch a handful of people lose their jobs out of spite, but to ensure that nobody within the company would ever again be treated as disposable simply because of how they looked. Vivienne rose slowly from her seat, facing the remaining board members with an expression stripped of its usual polish. For the first time in her career, she spoke without any prepared talking points, admitting plainly that the failure they were now confronting had begun with her. The next phase of the story unfolded away from the boardroom, in the quiet emotional space where accountability finally becomes personal rather than procedural. Vivienne requested a private conversation with Elias, choosing the very lounge where he had been humiliated hours earlier as the setting for her apology. This time, there were no assistants trailing behind her, no coffee carried at a careful distance, and no trace of the icy authority she typically projected. She admitted, without excuses, that she had judged him entirely by his appearance and had run her company for years out of fear of losing her own status rather than out of genuine leadership. Elias did not offer forgiveness easily or quickly, and he made no attempt to pretend the moment had erased what happened earlier that day. He told her briefly about his own upbringing near a small regional airport, where he had worked as an assistant mechanic and endured constant condescension from people who assumed his modest background meant he lacked value. When he eventually gained real influence and resources, he made a private promise to himself that he would never use power to belittle another person the way he had once been belittled. He admitted that his years of silence, meant to protect the company's stability, had also allowed people like Preston to thrive unchecked within a culture nobody was willing to challenge from the top. Vivienne asked cautiously whether he intended to remove her from her position entirely. Elias answered honestly that he had not yet made that decision, explaining that what mattered most to him now was observable action rather than a single moment of remorse. Without waiting for further prompting, Vivienne proposed eliminating several extravagant executive perks she had once considered untouchable, redirecting that budget toward operational safety and frontline employee training instead. Elias studied her carefully as she spoke, beginning to recognize something in her that had not been entirely destroyed by years of privilege. He realized, somewhat reluctantly, that Vivienne was not fundamentally cruel or beyond redemption, only shaped by an environment that had taught her to equate authority with elevated status. Her mistakes had been serious, but they were not evidence of an irredeemable character, merely the predictable result of a worldview she had never been forced to question until now. For the first time in her adult life, she seemed genuinely willing to look downward at the people who kept her company running, rather than only outward through the tinted window of a private aircraft. Elias thought briefly of his daughter, Nora, and the photograph he still carried, folded inside his wallet next to the new access card he had not yet used. He had raised her alone since she was small, working double shifts in the early years before his patents finally paid off, determined that she would never learn to judge people by the condition of their shoes. It struck him, sitting across from Vivienne in that quiet lounge, that she had never been given the chance to learn that lesson at all. Nobody had ever pulled her aside as a child and told her that the janitor and the chief executive deserved the exact same courtesy. He did not say any of this aloud, but something in his expression softened slightly, the beginning of a patience he had not expected to feel toward her that morning. The conversation concluded with Vivienne walking, unprompted, into the general boarding area where ordinary passengers and airline employees could see her clearly. She apologized to Elias publicly, her voice steady despite the visible discomfort on her face, acknowledging exactly what she had done and why it had been wrong. Nobody applauded immediately, and the silence that followed felt heavier and more genuine than any round of polite clapping could have managed. That silence, uncomfortable as it was, marked the beginning of something that finally resembled honesty. Elias returned to the boardroom one final time to deliver his ultimate decision regarding the future of Hawthorne Meridian Air. He signed the documents formally blocking Graham Kingsley's acquisition, ensuring the airline would not be dismantled and sold off in pieces. At the same time, he introduced a new governance resolution restructuring certain aspects of corporate power within the company. Under the new terms, the board would include dedicated representation from technical and safety staff. The safety division would report matters directly to ownership without executive filtering, and any complaint involving discriminatory treatment of customers or employees would trigger a mandatory independent investigation. Vivienne retained her position as chief executive, but only under a 6-month probationary period during which her leadership would be closely evaluated. Should she fail to meaningfully transform the company's internal culture within that window, Elias made clear that he would step in and replace her without hesitation. This resolution struck a careful balance between decisive consequence and reasonable opportunity, refusing to reduce Elias into a man motivated purely by vengeance. Graham Kingsley departed the building visibly furious, pausing at the door just long enough to warn Elias that he would eventually regret choosing sentiment over profit. Elias answered simply that he had chosen something more valuable than money, something that allowed an airline to still deserve the name printed across its fuselage. The statement, brief as it was, captured the entire foundation of his character more effectively than any lengthy speech could have managed. Preston was removed from his position overseeing the VIP lounge effective immediately, though Elias specifically instructed that his dismissal not be turned into a public spectacle for the media to feast on. He explained that a renewed company culture could not be built through public humiliation, even when directed at someone who had genuinely behaved poorly. Preston would still face a formal investigation and mandatory retraining should he wish to remain with the company in any capacity. The decision reflected the same restraint Elias had shown from the very beginning of the ordeal, choosing accountability over cruelty at every turn. As the meeting closed, Vivienne watched Elias sign his name across the final page of the agreement, a simple, unremarkable signature capable of reshaping the fate of an entire corporate empire. She understood, perhaps for the first time in her life, that genuine power rarely needed to announce itself loudly to be real. The people who required the least proof of their own importance were often, she realized, the ones who actually had the most to lose. Several weeks later, meaningful change had visibly taken root throughout Hawthorne Meridian Air. The private lounge was no longer treated as a symbol used to separate valued guests from unworthy ones, but simply as one professional service among many. Frontline staff received renewed training focused on respect and consistency rather than superficial impressions. The maintenance division received a significantly expanded budget, and the very scheduling system Elias had once designed years earlier was finally implemented company-wide with full executive support. Vivienne addressed the entire company during an all-staff meeting, delivering no polished or overly rehearsed speech. She explained plainly that she had once ordered the company's true owner removed from its own lounge simply because of how he was dressed. She refused to describe the incident as a minor public relations mishap, choosing instead to name it honestly as a serious failure of leadership and character. Elias did not stand on any stage or accept any applause during the gathering. He sat quietly near the back of the room among the maintenance and ground crew staff, the people he had always felt most comfortable around. When Vivienne invited him to stand and be recognized, he simply offered a small nod rather than any grand gesture. It was only in that moment that most of the room finally understood that the unassuming man sitting among them had personally saved the airline from being dismantled and sold away. The final scene of the story unfolded back at the airport, where Elias prepared to board a standard commercial flight rather than any private charter befitting his newfound recognition. Vivienne met him near the boarding gate and handed him a newly issued access card, one that carried no mention of diamond or platinum status, displaying only two simple words across its surface: owner access. Elias studied the card for a moment before tucking it quietly into his wallet, then joined the regular boarding line alongside everyone else waiting to board the aircraft. Vivienne asked, with genuine curiosity, why he chose not to use the priority privileges now available to him. Elias answered that a truly great airline was not defined by whether its owner boarded first, but by ensuring nobody was ever pushed to the back simply because someone assumed they were less important than they appeared. The response carried no bitterness, only the quiet conviction of a man who had spent his entire life proving that value could not be measured by appearances. As the aircraft eventually lifted off into a sky washed in the colors of early evening, the Hawthorne Meridian Air emblem gleamed briefly against the fading light along its fuselage. That symbol no longer represented the pride of a single wealthy family looking down from above, but instead carried the quiet promise of a man who had chosen to remain unseen for years. Real power, the story made clear in its final moment, only holds meaning when it is used to protect the people who have none. Inside the cabin, Elias found his assigned seat near the back of the aircraft, tucked his folder into the overhead bin, and exchanged a brief nod with the passenger beside him. An elderly woman traveling to visit her grandchildren for the first time in 2 years. He asked about her trip, listened patiently as she described her flight anxiety, and offered a few quiet words of reassurance about the pilots and the maintenance crews who had spent the morning inspecting every inch of the aircraft. She had no idea that the man beside her owned the airline carrying her safely through the sky, and he saw no reason to tell her. Somewhere above the clouds, as the cabin lights dimmed for the evening and the engines settled into their steady hum, Elias closed his eyes and allowed himself, for the first time that day, to simply rest.